Hello, and welcome everyone to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Roundhouse Foundation. My name is Mariah Rocker, and I'm your host for this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stick around for the whole show, don't worry, you'll be able to find this and every episode of Black History Quest on the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. This is our 7th episode of Black History Quest, OBP's bi-monthly history investigation and conversation program. This program is designed for fellow pioneers to geek out together and to add to the tapestry of the Black history here in Oregon. It's a chance to take a peek behind the curtain to look at the process of uncovering this history. As Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and presenting the experiences of African Americans statewide, Black History Quest is just one of the many ways that we illuminate this seldom told history. Check out our website, OregonBlackPioneers.org, for more information about the other ways that we do this work, or to connect with us to bring these stories to your community. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. As this is designed to be a conversation, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat so that we can discuss them live on air after the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this week's episode. So tonight, we are lucky to have Richard Engeman as our history investigator. Richard Engeman is a native Oregonian, a retired academic librarian, archivist, and historian who lives in Albany with his husband Terry and their 4 cats. His career with the Oregon Historical Society and the University of Washington Libraries immersed him in the history of the Pacific Northwest. He is the author of The Oregon Companion, a personal encyclopedic view of the state, and of Eating It Up in Oregon, a cookbook that reflects his interest in regional food history. He is a frequent contributor to the online Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the board of the Albany Public Library Foundation and the Albany Historic Landmarks Commission. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Richard Engeman. Hi, Richard.
Hello there. How are you?
Good. How are you? Glad to have you tonight.
Very good. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much for being this episode's history investigator, Richard. I am so thrilled to have you join us for Black History Quest. Now, Richard, you know all Black History Quest investigations begin with a single source that sparked some sort of interest. So can you start by telling us, perfect, what source you were looking into and what it was about it that caught your attention?
Well, what I got this from Oregon Black Pioneers, was a scan of a document from 1865 that listed the receipt of a $5 poll tax from each of 28 Black men and 42 Chinese men in Wasco County in 1865. They each paid $5. This was in response to what? That was one of the questions.
Sure.
So it was an intriguing item. First of all, that it came to me as a scan. So and as an archivist, I want to see the original document.
Sure.
What could AI have done with this scan? So
True.
I don't want that to happen. So that's another question. What is the original document? How did this come to be? And how did I not happen to? I've never heard of this before. So this
Sure.
All kinds of intriguing things.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it. As soon as you were presented with the source, it sounds like a lot of questions came to mind.
Yes.
That's good. That's a great place to start then, I think.
Yeah.
It demonstrates, how people can get interested in such a specific little thing.
Yeah.
So, I am curious, do you have any idea what this document might have represented, or at least what did you expect it to represent when you came across it?
What did I expect it to represent? Well, I expected it to represent a local tax, for one thing, not a state kind of initiative. And I expected it to be a kind of one-off thing. It was hard to figure out because, for one thing, this happened, this tax was collected in the middle of the Civil War, way out here. the fact that it was addressed to not only to blacks, but to Chinese and Hawaiians, which is what the term Kanaka means, is Hawaiian. It was like, what? This is quite a mixture here. This is, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and this is a document about not just one race, but several races, and it's a racial issue.
absolutely.
Hmm.
I can see why the document would have like piqued your interest,
Yeah.
and honestly, why we wanted to learn more about it as an organization. So, but now that all of the folks that are viewing at home and myself are excited to learn more, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to do the presentation. Can't wait to
Okay.
learn about it.
All right.
Bye.
Okay, so we're going to start off, and as you can see here, we will have a series of slides to go along with it. This is the phrase that really caught my attention. Each and every Negro, Chinaman, Kanaka, and mulatto. And the document is, of course, it's a scan. Well, one of the things that kind of has to be said before we get into the particulars of this document is that we need a little background. We already know that Oregon has a long history of trying to exclude blacks that began well before it became a state in 1859. In 1844, the provisional government, the self-organized settler government, enacted but never used a lash law to exclude blacks. And in 1845, slavery was banned, but there was no exclusion clause to that. After the treaty between Great Britain and the U.S. in 1846, and the U.S. Territory being established in 1848, slavery was prohibited. But the next year, the territorial legislature enacted a black exclusion law, which didn't apply to blacks who currently lived there. It was only apparently enforced once against Jacob Vanderpool. Historian and journalist Gregory Noakes describes Vanderpool as the only instance of an African American being expelled under one of Oregon's exclusion laws. And that law was repealed in 1854, again, before statehood. In November 9th of 1857, Oregon's male voters approved a draft state constitution. They've been aiming for statehood that banned slavery, but also excluded African Americans. The Constitution includes this provision. It says, no free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within the state, or hold any real estate, or make any contract, or maintain any suit therein. And the Legislative Assembly shall provide, by penal laws, for the removal by the public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them therein. Statehood was finally achieved on St. Valentine's Day of 1859, at which time that Constitution took effect. And while Oregon was the only state in where a black exclusion clause was actually in the state constitution, other states and territories had attempted to exclude or discourage blacks by law early in the 19th century, including Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa, and the 1850s, California. So that's not excluded. The efforts at exclusion were not exclusive to Oregon, but we were the only ones to plop it into our state constitution. The 1862 second regular session of the Oregon State Legislature saw the introduction of Senate Bill 1 by Kentucky-born Senator Solomon Fitzhugh. He was a Republican from Douglas County in the southwestern part of the state. It was titled "A Bill to Prevent the Immigration of Negroes and Mulattoes into the State." It was introduced on September 16th of that year, and eventually it died. However, the legislature did create a poll tax, and that's what we're going to be talking about. That law says, "Be it enacted by the Legislative Assembly of the State of Oregon that each and every Negro, Chinaman, Kanaka, and mulatto residing within the limits of the state shall pay an annual poll tax of $5 for the use of the county in which such Negro, Chinaman, Kanaka, and mulatto may reside." So that's the law that the Wasco County Sheriff followed, that produced the document that started me off on my quest here. Let's see here, trying to find out how to move to the next slide. Aha, here we go. Here you see this is the document itself, the scan that I received. It consists of several pieces of paper all pasted together and lists the names of each Black and Chinese man who was assessed $5 and collected by Charles White, Sheriff of Wasco County. Well, the document, according to Oregon Black Pioneers, the scan they received came to them from the History Museum of Hood River County. Well, that seems maybe like an odd source, but that's where I started looking into it. Hood River County was formed from Wasco County in 1908, long after this took place. So, okay, there's a connection with Wasco County. Maybe we start there. Plus, Oregon Black Pioneers had been in discussion with several people there about the Crawford family, which has several Oregon stories of Black family in Oregon. And Leanne Hoagie, who's shown on the left here, was one of the instigators, and she gave me some very good direction in terms of background research on the Negro question in the American West. So I had a chat with them, and they said, well, they had gotten this scan from, they weren't sure who, maybe somebody in Wasco County, maybe from the old Wasco County Courthouse, which is a still standing structure in the Dalles. This is how it looked about 1870, and this is how it looks today. So, the Dalles, I'll go over there and knock on their door. Well, nobody answered the door, nobody answered the telephone, nobody answered my emails. So I didn't hear from them. The Columbia Gorge Discovery Center and Museum in the Dalles, they didn't know anything about this document. So, well, where next? Where do we go? So my search widened, and I went to the State Archives, which is perhaps where I should have begun, but if I'd started there, I might not have met some wonderful volunteers in Hood River. So the online resources of the Oregon State Archives include a database with the location of county records throughout the state, and it's necessary because Oregon County records historically have been lost, stolen, burned, misplaced, forgotten, sent to a university in New Haven, Connecticut, whatever. And so keeping track of those still extant records is difficult. And at the State Archives, indeed, I found this document, the original, the first real thing. And not only that, they also had a brief list of payments for the tax in 1863, when $5 was procured from 30 Negroes and mulattoes, 28 Chinamen, and 1 Kanaka. and an 1864 listing by Sheriff Charles White again, listing the names of everybody who paid the poll tax in that year: 8 Negroes, 58 Chinamen, and 1 Kanaka. It's very much like the 1865 list. So, now we know that the original document is in the Oregon State Archives. Here's a picture of their reading room. And my research turned to find out what I could find out about the creation of the law, and then to find out how and where it was actually carried out. Well, the history of the law was not as easy to trace as I hoped, didn't necessarily expect. And it's a good thing, because I didn't expect it to be easy, and it wasn't. What I really had to turn to was the state and Senate legislative journals, the published accounting of what gets entered into the legislative process and what happens to it and how it ends up. But where could I find those legislative journals? So I went first to the Lynn County Law Library. The law librarian there was very helpful. Again, she gave me some great ideas. And they have a run of those journals, but they start in the 1880s, not the 1860s. So here I again start looking for where I can find it. Well, WorldCat, the online World Library Catalog, tells me, hey, I can find them at the state archives. Well, of course. I did not find any digital files of the Senate and House journals, which surprises me that if those have not been digitized. I didn't find them. Here's a picture of Amber, who is the Lynn County librarian, and some other very helpful people in my research, Scott Daniels and Nikki Collard of the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. Scott turned up a very interesting item we'll look at soon. And I also made an inquiry to all of the county clerk's office of every county that was in existence in 1862 when the law was passed. And I got some advice on that from not only the state archives, but also people like Terry Baxter, who's the head archivist for the Multnomah County Archives. And he could find nothing on this in his massive files of documents. Before the beginning of the 1862 session, the outgoing Democratic governor, John Whitaker, addressed the incoming Republican-dominated legislators 2 days before his last day in office. He ended his address with an admonition to them that they should deal with the fact that although the new state constitution forbade blacks to live in the state, there was not, in fact, yet any law to enforce that. He said, you guys, you should do something about this. Well, things are still kind of primitive, perhaps, in the state legislature. It's brand new. This is the Holman building, probably in the late 19th century. And this is where the state legislature met from statehood until 1876, when they finally had a Capitol building. The second and third floor had some state offices, and that's also where the meeting rooms were in which the legislature conducted its activities. And just to add a little bit of pictorial interest, here is Governor John Whitaker, a Democrat who served as our first governor, 1859 to 1862. And here is his in these Senate and House journals. Here is his the end of his address to the new legislators for the session of 1862. And what he said was, it is notorious that many persons of this class, that is, black, have already come to the state since the adoption of the Constitution and are now residing within its limits. This is certainly in violation of a plain provision of the Constitution. Here's a Civil War kind of reference. It makes no difference whether this is a wise and just provision in our fundamental law or not. It seems to me the duty of the legislature is clear on this subject, and I respectfully commend it to your attention. The clause of the Constitution above quoted is entirely inoperative without some legislation under it. Laws must be enacted providing penalties and officers appointed to carry such laws into execution. So says almost ex-Governor Whitaker. So, an act, House Bill 28, HB 28, was introduced September 13th by Representative Israel D. Haynes, a Republican from Jackson County in the southern part of the state. But apparently it didn't proceed. It was described as, quote, an act for the protection and taxation of Chinaman, Negroes, and Kanakas, and it proposed a poll tax, that's a head tax, of $4 per person per month. The inclusion of Chinese and Hawaiians appears to me to reflect Jackson County's dislike for gold miners fitting that description. This was gold mining country. And the use of the word protection in the act is meaningless. It's a meaningless sop, really, to kind of ease acceptance of the bill. The $48 per year tax is intentionally almost confiscatory. So HB 28 did not get far. Another House bill, HB 78, listed as an act to prevent Negroes and mulattoes from coming into the state, introduced by Rufus Mallory of Douglas County, was introduced and fell flat on its face. Senate Bill SB 1 comes in kind of late to the process, October 1st. An act to prevent the immigration of Negroes and mulattoes into Oregon. And it was read a first time and read a second time, but it was then tabled, went no further. Also on October 1st, HB 62, an act to provide for taxing Negroes, Chinamen, and Kanakas, was introduced by Representative Orlando Humason, Republican of Wasco County. Incidentally, Humason was also the first sheriff of Wasco County. Just to give another pictorial bit here, this is Israel Haynes, Republican who introduced one of these bills. Haynes later, again, perhaps following some gold was found in Baker County. He moved over there. The town of Haynes is named for him. Finally, by mid-October, both houses had approved HB 62, the last one I described, and it was signed by Governor Gibbs. So while the legislators did make some efforts to produce a law such as former Governor Whitaker said they should and must do, they failed. What was produced was the law that we are looking at today. Here is a picture of the Senate and House journals. This is the final law as enacted and as approved by Governor Addison Gibbs on October 15th of 1862. And although there were similar efforts to discourage or forbid Black Americans, as well as Chinese and Sandwich Islanders, Hawaiians, to stay in Oregon, other efforts were made in the 1864 regular session and an 1865 special session of the legislature. Again, nothing happened from that. The tensions of the Civil War played a large part in the fact that the new state's first governor was a Democrat, and its first legislature was heavily from the Democratic Party. But in 1862, a Republican was the governor. The legislature was heavily of the same persuasion. In the House, which had 34 members, there was only one Democrat, the notorious James D. Fay, notorious as a racist and a rabble rouser and an altogether scoundrelly sort of person who's rather personally interesting. But anyway, that's another story. And that kind of points out that Oregon in 1865, politics is kind of driven by party politics, and party politics are very much driven by newspapers, or perhaps it's vice versa. Many newspapers were in fact driven by politics. So, and I was after searching the legislative records, I started looking at newspaper records, hoping to find some of the things that are missing from the state House and Senate journals. What's missing is any discussion about the laws that are being discussed, any information really on who the major proponents were, and any commentary from outside the legislators. That you don't find that there. And there were not very many newspapers in Oregon in 1862. But I looked at papers from Salem and Portland, and also from Oregon City and Jacksonville and the Dalles and Eugene. But they weren't very much help. That was rather surprising to me. The Oregon Statesman newspaper in Salem had been run for several years as essentially an organ of the Democratic Party. Ashel Bush was the editor publisher, and he had really quite a group of people that was known. The group was known as the Salem Clique or the Salem Clique. And on the other side of the fence was Thomas Dreyer, who was the editor of the Portland Oregonian, which was founded as a Whig that now turns into Republican newspaper. So you have that. And the Statesman is still under the direction of Bush, but the Democrats are in 1862 not in the saddle, so to speak. To complicate my research, not all of the Statesman has been digitized, including parts in the 1860s. And I had to read about the 1862 session on microfilm at the Oregon Historical Society. And just to make things a little more upsetting and aggravating, shall we say, is a number of pages had been overprinted, double printed. You couldn't read the story at all because of the printing error, and there was no other copy available. So I just had to say, well, I'm not going to see what the Statesman said about that. And we'll pop in here too to picture. This is the incoming Republican governor, Addison C. Gibbs, who served from 1862 to 66. One thing I did find, I shouldn't say I found it, Scott Daniels at the Oregon Historical Society found in one of their scrapbooks, their scrapbook collections, an unidentified newspaper article that is titled "Affairs in Oregon" from our correspondence. So the implication is it's from a nearby state, but it's not from Oregon. Legislative doings, and down here you see anti-Negro and anti-Chinese legislation. The subject of the inferior races, quote unquote, has been before the Assembly and consumed some valuable time and wind. We have a few free Negroes and Chinamen in this state. They're generally industrious. useful and peaceable, but somehow or other they are thought to be eyesores to several of our white fellow sovereigns who think they have a monopoly on all the work there is in this world and are afraid these, quote, inferiors, unquote, will break it down. Just now it is said that uh, some of our Celtic brethren, that is Irish, threatened to turn their backs upon us and return to the old sod, the gem of the sea, and never come back at all, unless the niggers are driven out. But I think the most of the howling is the work of American demagogues who are playing for the Celtic, for the Irish vote. The bill to prevent Negroes from residing in the country and providing for their sale if found here was introduced in the Senate, and after being badly scarified, was referred to some committee where it will remain long enough to recover from its damaging wounds. The bill to tax and protect brackets rob in brackets Chinaman will probably share the same fate. The great need of this country is labor, and it looks as if the Assembly will not be foolish enough to destroy or prohibit it. So that gives you a sense that there is perhaps there are perhaps some other reasonable voices around, but be that as it may, the 1862 law was enacted. So let's look a bit at the law's impact and how it was carried out. The carrying out of the law was designated, or was set to the sheriff's office. Mostly, taxes are usually collected by the assessor's office, but this is not a tax based on the assessment of value of land, and so it gets handed off to the sheriff. An extensive search of state archives and newspapers, both online and on microfilm, and by sending an email or a snail mail to county clerks in every county, failed to turn up any other records than Wasco counties of the collection of this tax. And I didn't turn up anything else beyond Wasco County, with two possible exceptions. One was in 1864, when the Oregonian reports cryptically that about the collection of the tax in Multnomah County. And in 1870, the Portland Oregonian reported that, quote, last year in Jackson County, the county realized from the sale of Chinese mining licenses, there's another way to poke the Chinese, and of Kanaka, Negro, and China poll tax, the sum of $7,063. This revenue is now entirely cut off, the article says. Doesn't say why, doesn't add any other information. So I don't know any further details. And it was collected in Wasco County in 3 years, 1863, 4, and 5. The enactment of the 14th Amendment in 1868 appears to have effectively voided it. I found no further references in any legislative records about it. So if only 2 or 3 counties chose to enforce the new laws, the impact's not so great as it might have been expected. You might take a look at Oregon counties. When the law was enacted, this was county governments in Oregon. As you notice, there's a whole bunch of counties and a whole bunch of people on the west side of the mountains. Wasco County and 2 others take up the other 2/3 of the state. Oregon's population in 1860 was about 50,000. Wasco County, this whole area here, population 1,689, and more than half of those people were in the Dalles or nearby. By 1865, when our document was made, there had been a few changes. And you see that Wasco County has been shrunken a bit. Jackson County took a bite. A couple of new counties, Union County, Civil War, Union side, named that, and Grant County. Grant County is mining country around Canyon City, John Day, and there's mining going on in Baker City. The Dalles becomes a big uh, transportation hub due to these mid 1860s gold rushes, not only in Oregon, but also in the Boise Basin in Idaho, in western Montana, and so on. So it becomes a busy place, even if there aren't a lot of people sitting there, so to speak. So we have to think that this law was one in which the cost of sending a sheriff out to collect it um, could very well take cost more than it brought in terms of the expenses of sending the sheriff out to do that. And the $5 tax is a large chunk from a working man's income and equivalent to $150 or more today, but it's still is not one that's necessarily going to force someone taxed with it to decide to leave the state. But it certainly was a burden, and a burden that was imposed by race. So my conclusion is that enacting this law, the legislators felt they made, or at least they could tell their constituents they'd made some effort to deal with the concern of those Oregonians who hoped to bar blacks from the state, as the Constitution mandated, as well as those who held similar views about Chinese and Pacific Islanders, who were not mentioned in the Constitution. The carrying out of the law was delegated to county sheriffs, and most counties didn't tax the sheriff with collecting county, except for those landowners who were in arrears in their taxes. They might see the sheriff. And the penalty for not paying the tax was hard to administer. The penalty was if you didn't pay your $5, you had to work it out by working on the county roads at the rate of 50 cents per day, 6-day week, 12-hour day, but lunch was included. So that alternative payment was, I found no record of it actually ever being imposed. Well, another question is, and this is one that sort of, it helped me a lot to, personalize this rather flat document, a list of names. Can we identify anybody who's on this list? Can we say something about them? Here's a photograph from 1867 of the Dalles. Here we have it a little closer. And on the hill above in the center, you see some large buildings. That's Fort Dalles, an army post, undermanned because of the Civil War. To the right, you see some large buildings. Those are the shops of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. Their docks are out of sight to the right. And you see across the center a railroad trestle that is the Oregon Steam Navigation Company's Portage Railroad that carries goods and passengers from the landing at the Dalles around the impassable rapids and chasms of Celilo Falls and 5 Mile Rapids upstream. So there's that to go on, and over here you see the rest of the town. So with only an initial and a surname, tracking individuals on the poll tax was kind of an iffy proposition. The manuscript census records of 1860 and 1870 were the best bet, and those are available online in several various sites, and I got mine through Ancestry.com. And reviewing the names of the black men on the Moscow County list, I identified three beyond that list. North Wellington, who appears in the 1870 census as a house steward in San Francisco, 37 years old. Titus Clark is identified in the 1870 census as a hotel clerk in what is now Lake Oswego, Oregon, at 55 years old. And there's A. Period Flowers. I didn't find him in the 1870 census, but through Find a Grave and other sources, he was easily identifiable as Allen Irvin Flowers, who was the patriarch of a notable Oregon black family. This is the list that we were looking at, and you see that the fifth name on the list here paid his $5 on March 25th, A. Flowers. And this is a photograph of Allen E. Flowers, taken in Portland by the noted photography studio Buchtel and Stoll about 1875. When I first saw the name A. Flowers on that list, I had a kind of jolt because it jogged a memory for me. I worked in the early 1970s at the Oregon Historical Society as their photographs librarian. And one of the donations when I was there was a small collection of photographs of the Flowers family. It was significant because it was probably the first donation of family memorabilia from a black family to the Oregon Historical Society. And of course, it came in the early 70s, which was a time when there was suddenly growing interest in, as the bicentennial of our nation approached, in ethnic groups and various racial groups and their place in American history. So it was a significant donation. The Flowers family later gave another donation of photos, and all of those have now been digitized and are online, which is where I found this wonderful portrait of the patriarch. It was so this was kind of an interesting jolt for me. So there's a fascinating tale behind Allen Flowers, who paid his $5 in 1865. He was born in Ohio in 1847, and with his family came to Sacramento during the 1850s gold rush. And in 1865, when he was probably 18 or 19, he joined the crew of the famed coastal steamship Brother Jonathan, which traveled regularly between San Francisco and Portland. Incidentally, the Brother Jonathan sank that same year on July 30th off Crescent City with a loss of 225 people. Worst maritime disaster for a long time. Flowers landed in Portland on that ship, jumped ship, and apparently soon made his way to the Dalles, only to arrive there and pay his $5 in order to stay. And this brings us into the Dalles and its place in this story. The Oregon Steam Navigation Company, OSN, had a monopoly virtually on river traffic on the Columbia River during the mid-60s, 1860s, with these gold rushes. And there were two barriers to river transportation on the Columbia. One was the Cascades, near where Cascade Locks town is today, impassable to steamboats, and the Celilo Falls the 5 Mile Rapids above the Dalles. Oregon Steam Navigation had fleets of riverboats on the lower river between Astoria and the Cascades, on the middle river between the Cascades and the Dalles, and on the upper river and the Snake River above Celilo Falls. So they had 3 fleets of steamboats, and they owned the portage railroads that connected those. So, and we find out from Flowers' biography that he, for several years, worked on riverboats on the Columbia, going up to Lewiston and Umatilla and so on. So he almost certainly worked for OSN, which is known to have hired uh, other blacks as well. And the Dalles was a bustling point in 1865 because of the gold discoveries I've already mentioned. Miners and mining equipment and supplies and miners uh, came up to Portland via San Francisco and had to take a steamboat, a portage railroad, another steamboat, and then if they landed at the Dalles, they might have taken a pack train or other land methods to get to the mining camps in Boise Basin and um, Canyon City, or others had to again portage and go upstream further. So the Dalles was a small town with many transient workers uh, and miners. The Chinese were there, obviously, to go mining. Some of them probably also worked in freighting, and blacks who worked in freighting and on Oregon steam navigation boats and so on. So, and here's a later photo of Allen Flowers and one of his grandsons. Um, his biography indicates that after the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1883 to Portland, he worked on trains as a porter in charge, which would have made him a porter on sleeping cars in charge of other black porters. And by this time, the Northern Pacific Railway in the 1870s bought the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. And of course, the railroad drove the steamboats pretty well out of business. Flowers lived in Portland, Portland area, raised a family there, was a longtime member of the AME Church, and a property owner. He built several houses in Portland, and the family bought a farm on Mount Scott in what's now East Portland. So he was a successful Oregonian, and did make a positive mark on the history of our state. This is Allen Flowers' obituary. Born Columbus, Ohio, 1847, died Portland, Oregon, 1934. So the 1862 poll tax, to kind of round this up, was enacted to support the intention of the language in the new state constitution. But the onset of the Civil War and the rise of the new Republican Party may have tempered the anti-black sentiments a bit. And when the 1857 Constitution was approved, by 1862, there had been some changes expressed on the election of a Republican governor and a Republican House and Senate. The law that emerged from this was certainly impacted by racial biases against Chinese and Hawaiians, which suggests that the presence of blacks, persons who might be enslaved if slavery were to be established, say, in Oregon, was not the driving impulse behind the poll tax law. A broader racial prejudice was. And while the initial proposals from both the Senate and the House were monetarily harsh, that $4 a month was nearly $50 a year rather than $5. What emerged was a punitive law that extracted a substantial but not ruinous fee. And it didn't, in fact, address the constitutional mandate to exclude blacks from the state. It was a discretionary law. Each county apparently was to administer the collection of it as they saw fit or not. Wasco and Jackson and Multnomah counties may have collected money from that. But we have no evidence that other counties did. The tax collection in Wasco County reflects the position of the Dalles in the mid 1860s as a hub of transportation activity and related to the gold discoveries. And Moscow County Sheriff Charles White, in his obituary, says he was really tough on people who disobeyed the law. Charles White, he would have found these men, Chinese, Kanakas, blacks, very close to town. Wasco County was huge, but nobody lived south of the Dalles, virtually uninhabited. Even though Wasco County was the largest in the state of land area, half of the 3,000 people that may have been in Wasco County in 1865 lived in the Dalles. So I will end on that note. If you're interested, here's some of the background reading that I found really useful, and I thank various people that I encountered in my research for saying, you ought to see this and you ought to read that. But here are some other things to read. In the end, the 1862 poll tax was a racially motivated tax that was an expensive irritant to those who paid it, and it was a very minor revenue source for those counties that enforced it, and a very minor and utterly meaningless salve for state legislators who wanted to claim they were giving their constituents what they said they wanted in their constitution. And so my conclusion is essentially that this 1862 law is a wart on the state's history, and it's a small wart, but it's a curious and interesting one. And there we are. Thank you.
That is so great. That honestly, I am blown away by your phrasing that it is a wart on state's history. I feel like that is an absolutely perfect way to describe it, like a wart on state's history. I mean, it certainly didn't have super long-lasting impacts, and sounds like it didn't really impact that many people at all. But it's certainly something to worry about and could be, demonstrative of a larger issue. So yes. A wart is just like perfect.
Yeah.
But I also really appreciate how your presentation gave background on how this poll tax came to be, and more specifically, how it was really to kind of support the new state constitution. Mm-hmm. Also, I really appreciated that you mentioned the other attempts at passing similar legislation, just to demonstrate the fact that this wasn't though it was a blip in a wart, like we described, it wasn't, totally unprecedented. There was clearly background leading to this. So I really appreciate that you offered that. But I have a ton of questions for you, and are some questions that came through on the chat. Recognizing that there is very little information available online and in all of the archives and stuff, I was curious, were you able at all to identify like how people were targeted other than the color of their skin? I mean, did they just run into the sheriff and he decided to charge them? Do you have any idea how it worked out, how it played out?
It's difficult to say. If you look at the list from Wasco County that we started with, the laws prescribes that this tax should be collected. I think it's in a 3-month period, like between March and July or something like that. But if you look at that list, it starts in March, but it keeps going. And he picks $5 and $3 per people one day and $2 a week later. And so I think it's that he's running into people that, there's one of those.
Did I charge you yet?
I see him and I don't have his name down. So whether that was what happened in other places, I don't know. But yeah, my suspicion there is that the sheriff he had it on his mind he was going to collect this tax, but he wasn't going to go and get everybody on a big roundup.
Sure. I suppose that makes sense. And it's, I'm sure, very difficult to kind of track that sort of thing. Yeah, I was also curious, since, most of the poll taxes were likely collected directly in the Dalles, Do you suspect that most of the folks impacted may have just been working in the area on steamboats or for mining purposes and weren't
That's kind of
necessarily like all the time residents?
right. That's kind of my feeling is that
Sure.
some of these were residents, and some of those who worked for the Oregon Steam Navigation may well have been residents, but they were often away. But a lot of people were transient workers who, or
Mm,
miners. They're going to or from the mines. Maybe they're packers who are carrying stuff for other people or
sure.
whatever. And so they just happened to be on the spot and they got caught. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
that's so unfortunate.
yeah.
I am also curious, do you have a theory why most county sheriffs appeared to have not bothered collecting this poll tax? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think in part it's because they didn't have as didn't have it as easy as maybe Sheriff White did in the Dalles. If you're looking at the west side of the mountains, you're looking at people who are mostly farmers and they're settled. And
Sure.
the sheriff might well know where there is a black worker on such and such a farm, etc. But it's 20 miles away, and am I going to go out there and you
Mm,
know
sure.
collect that $5 or not? Is it worth it? So, and there's not there are few concentrations of blacks as there would have been in the Dalles
Sure.
to encourage the sheriff to and this is kind of outside of his regular duties. He doesn't normally
Right.
do this kind of tax collection. The sheriff is the one who is sent out if you haven't paid your property taxes for 4 years, and by golly, you owe a substantial sum to the county. They'll
Right.
send the sheriff out, but for it's just
Sure.
not.
That actually, when you point that out, the fact that most of these counties wouldn't have had big populations, that makes sense as to why the other two counties that you encountered, Multnomah County and Jackson County, may have been the other ones to
Right,
do it because they would have had higher populations of Black people to
exactly.
target. So
Yes,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
We got a question from the chat actually from Leanne Hoagie, who asked something that had been on my mind as well. So thank you, Leanne.
Uh-huh.
The 1865 document talks about a return of the amount of the tax. So does that mean that this was the last year of applying that tax? And did you see
No,
anything about why they returned it? Okay.
no, yeah. What it's being used as uh, your returns, um, the money you collected are called the return. You get
Oh,
if you get dividends, those are the returns on your investment. So
right.
it's just saying this is the amount.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh, okay. So it's
different
literally
use.
just
You
kind of a
don't use it that
phrasing.
way often. Yeah,
Okay. That's interesting. I totally didn't understand that this whole
yeah,
time. So I
yeah.
appreciate that. Also, out of curiosity, I think you did mention this in the presentation, but just in case somebody missed it, Janice Dilg asked, what would the equivalent of $5 be today? Because that is
Uh,
important. What's a $5 tax
yeah.
to
Well,
folks?
always those things are hard to come up with. Um, and there is a kind of conversion formula that historians often use that is available online, and I use that, and it would have made it about $100, but I figured it was probably more than that. For one thing, things are different out here than they were in, say, Pittsburgh,
Sure.
and they're more expensive. And so I say around $150 or more. Um, but when people have an annual income maybe of a couple $100,
Mm.
yeah, you're seeing that it doesn't look like much now, but it's a chunk that you'd rather keep in your pocket. Please, I need it for food. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure these people were struggling. They didn't really have
Yeah,
the same economic means as the rest of the people that weren't being targeted by this poll
right.
tax.
And nobody
So
has
yeah,
a secure job with a pension at the end, etc. These are,
exactly.
everybody is doing gig work. And, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, I'm gonna cut it down to two more questions, even though I could ask many more. But I'm gonna ask if you had more time, what would your next research directions be from here?
On this one, Well, as I say, I only found three people. Anything, I, I'm
Sure.
just I'm just interested in chasing some of those people down.
Yeah.
What else happened here? You know, Mr. Flowers has a great story behind him, and what of the story? A hotel keeper in Oswego. Today we think of Lake Oswego as the place for the rich and the indolent. Uh, but in 1865, that was an iron making town.
Oh, didn't
You
know
know,
that.
yeah. Who
Sure.
knows? If you go to Lake Oswego and you go to the park and you see the furnace that's there in the park, but
Mm,
it's not a prominent part of our uh, general history of Oregon. But yeah, it was an industrial town, and so if he's a hotel keeper, he's probably uh, keeping housing workers for the Lake Oswego Ironworks,
sure.
not not being a caddy at the golf course.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. That's so interesting. We actually did just get another question from the chat, so I do want to ask that. Rebecca Landis asks, would employers possibly want to pay it to retain an employee? Do you think that was possible? That the tax
it
is paid on
is.
someone's behalf? Yeah,
Yeah, it is possible, and I kind of suspected that maybe Oregon Steam Navigation did that. I don't
sure.
know, but yeah, it certainly is possible that you know I'll go away, Sheriff White. Here's $5. Beat it. Leave my guys alone. Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, and then finally, just to kind of wrap this all up, I'm going to ask the question I ask everyone, which is how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history, locally, about a specific person, etc., however you want to frame it?
Well, for me, it certainly expanded my understanding of what you could go through as a
Mm,
person of color in the 1860s, and it gave a new perspective on what was going on during. I've been thinking a good deal about the Civil War and why we had it and what the outcome is. And we often think of Oregon as being outside of that. It's
right.
out here out west. And one of the books that I remember reading many years ago, uh, which was essentially about the Civil War in Oregon, it was a diary of a soldier who was stationed at um, Fort Hoskins, a remote army post in the Coast Range Mountains that was essentially there in order to prevent whites from encroaching on reservation land. But the title of the book is All Quiet on the Yam Hill, and his diary talks about how boring it is and how well there's all this excitement back east, and he's just. And so that's kind of like that was my first introduction. The Civil War in Oregon was ho hum, and yeah,
Sure.
and obviously it wasn't. I mean, we weren't shooting people up, but they were having obviously were having ferocious arguments in the state legislature. And I mentioned James D. Fay is a notorious Democrat in the House. He was noted for various acts of physical violence. So
Mm.
there were yeah, we had some excitement out here. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So to sum up, we definitely had some excitement, and you can see it through
Yeah,
the sorts of things like this
yeah,
book
it
does.
changed my perspective a bit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. I'm sure that for some of the folks, I mean, a lot of folks probably never even heard about this until we started talking
Yeah.
about it in preparation for Black History Quest. So I'm
Yeah.
sure that this did change the perception of lots of people. But we've taken enough of your time today, anyways. So I just want to
Okay.
thank you so much for
Oh, thank you for
being
giving
this resource. Oh yeah,
giving me the opportunity to do this. It's been really a fun, research quest for me. So,
Okay, good. That's good. That is what we want to hear. And
yeah.
it has been absolutely wonderful to learn from you this evening. So, yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Okay. Well, good night then. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to thank the Roundhouse Foundation in Sisters, Oregon for sponsoring the show. Make sure to learn more about them and the projects that they are doing and that they support at roundhousefoundation.org. Now, Oregon Black Pioneers is a nonprofit, and we depend on the support of ordinary people who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history, like tonight's. If you enjoyed this show and would like to support it and others like it, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers. And if you have any questions about this episode or would like to become a future history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. Stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in July, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.